It is the evening of the 27th of April 1790. Revolution is in the air in Paris, and has been for nearly a year now. This evening, some of the more radical revolutionaries gather in the Cordeliers district of the city just south of the River Seine, near Notre Dame Cathedral. They are there to elect a leader of the Cordelier Club. The society they are setting up is intended to act as a pillar of the radical revolution, and it soon adopts the motto Liberté, Égalité, Fraternité. The members of the Cordelier Club are men who believe that the monarchy should be done away with altogether and a democracy set up in its place. That evening, they elect a political firebrand who has become known for his incendiary speeches and revolutionary activity as their first president. His name? Georges Danton, architect of the First French Republic. The man known to history as Georges Danton was born Georges-Jacques Danton on the 26th of October 1759 in Arcis-sur-Aube, a small town in the Champagne region, approximately 100 kilometers to the east of Paris. His father, Jacques Danton, was the son of a farmer who became a lawyer and served as a prosecutor in Arcis. After his first wife, Marie, died in childbirth in 1753, Jacques married Madeleine Camus the following year. Madeleine's father worked as a building contractor and helped to maintain the condition of the roads in the region. The couple would have 2 daughters before the birth of their son, Georges, in 1759. 3 years later, Jacques Danton died unexpectedly on the 24th of February 1762, just shy of his 40th birthday. Thanks to his late father's position as a lawyer, Georges grew up in a large house with a barn and several acres of land on the outskirts of Arcis. 18th century France was a highly unequal society, and while the Dantons had experienced a degree of social mobility, they remained closer to their peasant roots than the bankers and businessmen of Paris and the other cities and towns who could challenge the status of the landowning aristocracy. As an infant, Georges' mother could not provide him with milk, and it was common practice in the countryside for young children to be suckled by a cow from the family's barn. On one occasion, the boy was attacked by a jealous bull who mauled his face and left him with a permanent scar. A few years later, when Georges was 7 years old, another bull attack broke his nose. A bout of smallpox also possibly added to the problem, a disease which left many people badly scarred on their face in early modern times. After receiving some informal education in reading and writing from a spinster woman next door, Georges began his formal education at the age of 8 at the Arcis Grammar School, run by the Catholic Church. He was not fond of studying and regularly played with his friends on the banks of the River Aube. Here, Georges enjoyed swimming back and forth across the river. It was a strangely upwardly mobile middle-class upbringing, yet also one that harked back to the rural, rustic existence of many French people in centuries gone by. Like many future revolutionaries, Georges' family intended him for a career in the church. At the suggestion of a priestly brother, Madeleine sent her son to a college in Troyes to prepare him for entry into a seminary. The young Danton did not take well to his new surroundings, complaining to his mother about the strict rules, the endless ringing of bells, and the limited recreation time. After 2 years, his mother took pity on him and sent him to a lay boarding school. Although the institution was run by priests, the Oratorian fathers were more liberal-minded. Here, in addition to Greek and Latin texts, Danton was introduced to Enlightenment philosophy and thought. Danton fared much better in this environment and took a great interest in the history of Republican Rome, entertaining fellow pupils and teachers alike with his performances of Cicero's speeches in Latin class. While poor handwriting hindered his ability to communicate on paper, at the age of 15, Danton applied his rhetorical skills to defend his classmate Jules Paré from a beating by arguing that it was morally wrong to inflict such punishments. A few months before Danton turned 15, King Louis XV of France died in May 1774 and was succeeded by his grandson, Louis XVI. The new king was due to be crowned on the 11th of June 1775 at the Cathedral of Rheims in northern Champagne. Danton was keen to see the event firsthand, especially as his teachers had made the coronation the subject of the college's essay prize. After collecting donations from his friends, he slipped away and caught the stagecoach to Rheims. While the public could not witness the ceremonies inside the cathedral, the teenage Danton was part of the crowd that watched the king leave the cathedral wearing the crown of Charlemagne. He struggled to explain his absence from school upon his return to Troyes, but was forgiven after admitting that he had made a mistake and won the annual essay prize. While his uncle still hoped that he might continue with a church career, after finishing school, Danton decided to follow in his father's footsteps into law. Since Danton would receive his legal training in Paris financed by Camus relatives, he repaid his family's generosity by transferring his claims on his father's estate to his stepfather, Jean Racordin, a clothmaker who married his mother in 1770. In the spring of 1780, and not yet 21 years old, Georges Danton left Arcis and went to Paris for the first time in his life. He called at the chambers of a barrister named Vinot, who had previously acted on behalf of the Camus, only to find that the lawyer had no recollection of their past dealings. Danton's prospects of gaining any assistance from Vinot declined further when he was given a short legal document to copy, which prompted a comment about his illegible handwriting. The young man shot back, "Sir, I am not here to be a copyist," and Vinot agreed to take him on as a clerk. A week later, Danton moved into Vinot's chambers on the Ile Saint-Louis in the River Seine. He soon began to familiarize himself with the Parisian legal scene by attending to business at the Palais de Justice, the city's law courts located in the neighboring Ile de la Cité. He imitated the leading lawyers of the day and joined fellow clerks to discuss legal issues in nearby cafes. Danton continued to miss certain aspects of country life, and he took to swimming in the Seine, despite the river traffic and the confusion of Parisian onlookers. During his first year in Paris, Danton was struck down by a serious lung infection and was close to death, but his strong constitution enabled a slow but steady recovery. While confined to his bed, Danton used the opportunity to focus on his legal studies and to delve deeper into the works of Enlightenment writers such as Montesquieu, Voltaire, Rousseau, and Diderot. After 3 years clerking at Vinot's chambers, Danton was ready to sit his bar examinations in 1783. Following a recommendation from his mentor, he opted to take his exams in Reims rather than face the notoriously demanding examiners in Paris. By the summer, he was back in Paris with his law diploma and stayed on at Vino's chambers as a junior partner. In a sign of the worsening financial crisis that was crippling the French state at that time, most of Danton's early clients were debtors. After coming to the throne, King Louis XVI was keen to reverse the humiliation that France had suffered by ceding Canada and several rich colonies to Britain in 1763 at the end of the 7 Years' War. He invested heavily in the French Navy and supported the American War of Independence from Britain by providing loans to the fledgling U.S. government. Although French assistance enabled George Washington to force Lord Cornwallis's surrender at Yorktown in 1781, the British gave few concessions to the French in the ensuing Treaty of Paris of 1783, even though the talks were held in France. King Louis had little to show for his intervention in North America beyond exacting some revenge on the British. Conversely, the French state was on the precipice of bankruptcy. Although the king and his ministers had considered raising taxes from the aristocracy to make up the shortfall, in light of noble opposition, the government had resorted to taxing the middle and lower classes instead, whose capacity to resist was as limited as their capacity to shoulder the additional burden. Danton was familiar with the sentiments in the popular press, which criticized the profligacy of Louis XVI and his Austrian queen, Marie Antoinette, at a time of economic difficulty. Danton soon became immersed in the Parisian café scene, a key source of political discussion at the time. By 1787, his circle included Jules Paré, his old classmate from Troyes, and a fiery young lawyer named Camille Desmoulins, who worked at the Parlement of Paris. Unlike the British Parliament, French parlements were not legislative assemblies, but rather judicial bodies that registered the king's laws. Danton and Desmoulins shared a similar outlook and had complementary skills. The latter had a stammer which made him a poor speaker, but he was an excellent writer. The three men were regulars at a café called the Parnasse on the right bank of the Seine, opposite the law courts. Another attraction of the place for Danton was the daughter of the café's owner, the 24-year-old Antoinette Gabrielle Charpentier. Danton had regular dalliances with local women in Paris, though his most enduring relationship was with Françoise du Hautoir from Troyes, who he first met within months of his arrival at Paris. As Françoise prepared to marry an older and wealthier man, Danton set his sights on Gabrielle. He began his approach by befriending her Italian mother, who worked the till, engaging in small talk about Italian literature. Their conversations amused Gabrielle, who saw in him a strong, intelligent man and ignored his physical blemishes. Her father, François Charpentier, was keen to marry his daughter to a lawyer, but had doubts about Danton's prospects. Rather ironically, it was Danton's ex-girlfriend, Françoise du Hautoir, who came up with the solution that enabled him to marry Gabrielle. She informed him that her betrothed, a lawyer named Huy de Pézy, who sat on the king's council, was preparing to sell his practice, which could earn him an income of over 20,000 livres a year. To meet the price tag of 78,000 livres, Danton relied on a 30,000 livres loan from Françoise du Hautoir 15,000 livres from Gabriel's dowry, and additional financial assistance from his family in Arcis and Troyes. Danton purchased the practice in March 1787, and in June 1787 he was inducted into the King's Council by Louis XVI. 2 days later, Danton married Gabrielle at the church of Saint-Germain-l'Auxerrois, located next to the Louvre in central Paris. The newcomer to the King's Council soon began to spell his name Danton with an apostrophe to claim noble ancestry. The conservative aristocrats who sat on the body were keen to test him out by asking him to deliver a speech in Latin about the political situation in the country. The young lawyer took the challenge head-on and began by saying that the nobility and high clergy should be prepared to sacrifice some of their wealth to help address the financial crisis. This was not too controversial, but Danton carried on by saying that he saw a revolution on the horizon if things did not improve, one which could only be avoided by introducing reforms to contain popular discontent. He concluded with an ominous warning: "Woe to those who provoke revolution, and woe to those who carry it out." After moving into an apartment south of the river at the Cour du Commerce, near the church of Saint-Sulpice, Danton hired his friend Paré as his legal partner. In 1788, the practice had a steady stream of work. Nevertheless, he still had to pay off the debts he incurred to purchase his practice, and the birth of a son, named François to Gabrielle, put additional pressure on the family's finances. While his income depended on the survival of the monarchy, and Danton did not wish to see Louis XVI deposed, he believed that the days of absolute monarchy were numbered and that France would soon follow the example of Britain in trying to limit the powers of the monarchy. Proposals for constitutional reform were being discussed regularly at the Nine Sisters Masonic Lodge, which Danton and Desmoulins joined after the former's induction into the King's Council. Named after the 9 muses of classical antiquity, the Nine Sisters had inducted Voltaire into their ranks shortly before his death in 1778. Living members included Benjamin Franklin, who had been a fixture in Parisian society as American ambassador before his return to the United States in 1785, the Abbé Emmanuel Joseph Sieyès, a clergyman and political theorist, and Joseph Ignace Guillotined, a doctor who later gave his name to the device that he proposed as a humane method of execution. By late 1788, widespread rioting was occurring in the working-class districts of Paris as the price of bread almost doubled after a poor harvest. Danton recognized that it was not enough to talk politics behind closed doors, and any program of political reform had to address the people's concerns. The 29-year-old Danton stepped onto the political stage at a meeting hall near his home, which had previously belonged to the monastic order of Cordeliers. Thanks to his towering physique, his booming voice, and his persuasive rhetoric, he became a powerful advocate for the working people. Following an unusually cold winter, Danton found another platform in the spring of 1789, when the reformist Duke Louis-Philippe of Orléans, a cousin of King Louis, opened up his gardens at the Palais Royal in the centre of Paris to the public. The Duke's grounds became a bustling centre of political speech-making, and Danton's thunderous voice demanded rights for the people, who were attacking royal officials and noble estates across the country. King Louis and his ministers recognized that the monarchy alone was powerless to solve the country's political and economic problems. Following the advice of his finance minister, Jacques Necker, the king agreed to convene the Estates General, the ancient assembly bringing together the three estates of France: the nobility, the clergy, and the commoners. Since the Estates General had not been convened since 1614, there was a public debate on how the body should be constituted. In an influential pamphlet entitled "What is the Third Estate?", the Abbé Sieyès argued that the Third Estate was capable of representing the French nation on its own, and there was no longer any need for representatives from the first two estates, the clergy and the nobility. Such a demand proved too radical for King Louis, but he reluctantly agreed to double the representation of the Third Estate. In January 1789, Louis formally issued a royal edict to convene the Estates General at the Palace of Versailles in May. Political meetings were swiftly held throughout the country to elect delegates to the 1,200-member body, consisting of 300 representatives from the First and Second Estates and 600 from the Third. The Cordeliers district, to which Danton belonged, was among the most radical in Paris. In addition to Danton, leading political figures included his friends Paré and Desmoulins, who launched a newspaper called La France Libre, and the playwright Fabre d'Églantine. Another figure who was on the periphery of Danton's circle was the Swiss-born Jean-Paul Marat, a prolific journalist who fired off articles vowing to eliminate the aristocrats and high churchmen whom he accused of ruining France. Danton championed the sans-culottes, the common people of Paris, so called because they could not afford to wear breeches. Despite this, the Cordelier electorate decided for the time being to elect moderate figures to the assembly that would choose the capital's representatives to the Third Estate. This was reflective of the revolution to come. It would start out moderate in approach and become more radical over time. Shortly before the Estates General was to meet, Danton's son, François, died just shy of his first birthday. The grieving father returned to his native Arcis to bury his dead child. Despite assembling in Versailles in early May, the Estates General failed to come to an agreement on procedural issues, and on the 17th of June, the members of the Third Estate passed a motion moved by Sieyès to proclaim themselves the National Assembly. 3 days later, the deputies found the doors to the meeting hall locked and reconvened in the royal tennis court, where they swore an oath to continue their meetings until they had decided on a new constitution for France. The National Assembly's most prominent leader was Honoré Gabriel Riquetti, the Comte de Mirabeau, a reforming aristocrat who chose to represent the Third Estate. When a royal representative attempted to close the National Assembly down on the 23rd of June, Mirabeau challenged him, "Tell those who send you that we are here by the will of the people and will leave only by the force of bayonets." The challenge went unanswered, the National Assembly continued with its business, and by late June, the king was compelled to acknowledge its legitimacy. The formation of the National Assembly unburdened Danton from any vestige of loyalty he had for the monarchy, and his loud and frequent denunciations of royal tyranny earned him the nickname the Thunderer in the new parliament. In early July, Camille Desmoulins, introduced Danton to an old friend who had been elected to the Estates General and was making a rare visit to the Palais Royal. He was Maximilien Robespierre, an intelligent young lawyer from Arras who had studied alongside Desmoulins at the prestigious Louis le Grand College in Paris. While Robespierre tended to avoid the Palais Royal, Danton was elected to a public speakers committee which spoke out against the cruelty of royal punishments. Elsewhere, the king's authority melted away as French regular soldiers defected to the citizen militias formed in the residential districts. In response, the king strengthened his security at Versailles by mobilizing Swiss and German Guards units. In early July, the king dismissed Necker, the only official whom the liberal middle classes believed had a chance of solving the government's financial problems. The following day, after making a trip to Versailles to see the situation for himself, Desmoulins appeared before the Palais Royal and jumped onto a table and announced, "Citizens, I have just come from Versailles. Necker is dismissed. The death knell has sounded for patriots. There is not a moment to lose. Not one moment. To arms." The crowd answered his call and armed themselves with weapons deposited by defecting troops. On the 14th of July, 1789, a large group of the sans-culottes marched on the fortress of the Bastille, a notorious prison which symbolized royal despotism in the heart of Paris. After an initial exchange of musket fire, the governor recognized that the medieval fortress could not withstand the imminent cannon fire and surrendered. Clemency was not given, and within hours his head was being paraded around the streets of Paris by the revolutionaries. Despite going down in history as the defining moment of the French Revolution of 1789, the storming of the Bastille was a spontaneous event. Danton was not present himself and only arrived at the scene that evening. To make up for his absence the previous day, Danton led a small group of Cordelier militia to storm the Bastille again the following evening. The fortress was now under the control of the National Guard, commanded by the 32-year-old Marquis de Lafayette, who had served with distinction at George Washington's side during the American Revolutionary War. Lafayette's authority as commander of the National Guard was shaky, even though the citizen militias were now officially National Guardsmen. Danton saw no harm in marching the temporary commander of the Bastille garrison away to the city hall, where he was disappointed to see the moderate Jean-Sylvain Bailly being elected mayor of Paris. Danton refused to recognize Bailly's authority, and after being elected president of the Cordelier Assembly in September, he established his own local government in the Cordelier district, one which tried to disobey Bailly's orders as mayor. He could count on support in the popular press from Marat and Desmoulins, though their rhetoric was often too radical for his liking. The Cordeliers could also call on playwrights such as Marie-Joseph Chénier and Fabre de Glantine to channel revolutionary ideas to popular audiences. In the meantime, the National Constituent Assembly was drafting a new constitution for France. Assisted by Sieyès, Condorcet and Talleyrand, renegade bishop and diplomat extraordinaire, Mirabeau abolished the feudal estates and deemed each French man and woman an equal citizen. While private property was guaranteed, the church and aristocracy lost large amounts of land which would be sold off to the public. Danton was not opposed to a weak monarchy remaining in place, but he was shocked that the Constituent Assembly allowed Louis a veto over its decisions. The king himself was not pleased to have most of his powers removed, and rumours abounded that he intended to escape. In response to reports that the king was intending to strengthen his royal bodyguard, Danton and the Palais Royal Committee planned a march on Versailles. On the morning of the 5th of October 1789, 7,000 Parisians marched on Versailles, most of them women, in an effort to prevent the king's troops from firing on them. Upon their arrival, they broke through the cordon of the king's guard and stormed the palace. Lafayette arrived belatedly with 15,000 National Guardsmen and persuaded King Louis to order his royal guard to stand down in order to avoid bloodshed. The following morning, the women of Paris escorted the royal family under duress into Paris and took them to the Tuileries Palace next to the Louvre. Henceforth, they were virtually under house arrest in central Paris. The struggle between the Cordeliers and the Parisian authorities intensified in January 1790 when Lafayette led 3,000 men to arrest Marat. Danton played for time by seeking an official arrest warrant, allowing Marat to escape. Danton was next to be targeted, and in March he was charged with sedition, but he went unharmed and the case was dropped in May. Despite his prominence with the fledgling revolution, Danton lacked electoral legitimacy. Moreover, his efforts to acquire it were undermined by Mayor Bailly, who abolished the Cordelier electoral district in May 1790. Although Danton won election to the Paris Commune in July for the new Théâtre Français section, he was denied his seat due to a procedural loophole. Following a brief trip to Arcis with Gabrielle and their newborn son Antoine, Danton returned to Paris, where he took control of the Cordeliers Club, founded by Desmoulins in April in anticipation of the district's abolition. The Cordeliers lacked the prestige of the Jacobin Club, which met next to the Tuileries, so Danton and several Cordeliers now also joined the Jacobins to take part in political discussions. At his first meeting in September, Danton was disappointed to see that the debates were being dominated by Robespierre, though he preferred him to Lafayette and Bailly, both of whom felt that the revolution had gone far enough. They were joined by an ailing Mirabeau, who wanted to ensure the king came to no harm. During the early summer, Danton had been shocked when Mirabeau offered a bribe to help protect Louis in the event he was deposed. In November, Danton returned to the political spotlight when the Parisian sections approached him to serve as their spokesman in the Constituent Assembly against the government, after royalist officers brutally suppressed a mutiny in Nancy in August. Within a week of Danton's accusations against 3 government ministers, all of them were forced to resign. By February 1791, Danton was elected to the governing council of the Paris department alongside Mirabeau, Sieyès, and Talleyrand. By now he was after establishing as an intermediate figure in the French Revolution. He was not one of the moderates who wanted to see little change and the king left in power, yet he was nowhere near as radical as Robespierre, Marat, and some of the extreme Jacobins who wanted to get rid of the king entirely and establish a republic. On the 2nd of April 1791, Mirabeau died at the age of 42, sending shockwaves through the political system. Without his protection, King Louis felt vulnerable and sought permission to celebrate Easter at the Palace of Saint-Cloud to the west of the city. This, inspired rumours that the royal family was seeking to escape. Danton responded by mobilising the Cordelier militia to prevent Lafayette from escorting the royal party. Less than 3 months later, on the 20th of June, the royal family did indeed escape from the Tuileries Palace in disguise, headed for the border with the Austrian Netherlands, part of the Habsburg Empire, ruled by Marie Antoinette's brother Emperor Leopold II, and approximating to modern-day Belgium. Danton now called for a republic to be established at the Constituent Assembly on the 22nd of June. By then, the royal party had been intercepted at Varennes and dragged back to Paris. Still, the moderates were keen to avoid provoking Austria and Prussia into military action by treating the king and queen too harshly after the flight to Varennes. On the second anniversary of the attack on the Bastille, Danton and the Cordeliers drew up a petition demanding the Constituent Assembly rescind a decree stating that Louis was not to blame for the escape. As Danton and his supporters invited Parisians to sign the petition at the Champ de Mars, they were confronted by Lafayette's National Guard. At least 50 people were killed in the ensuing clash, and Danton, fearful of arrest, briefly eloped from Paris and crossed to England for a few weeks until the immediate furore had died down. By the time Danton returned to Paris in early September 1791, the Paris Commune had withdrawn its arrest warrants and elections were due to be held for the new Legislative Assembly that was to replace the Constituent Assembly. Danton fancied his chances of election, although he was irritated by Marat's articles in his newspaper L'Ami du Peuple, proposing Danton as a dictator to sweep away the remnants of the old order. Danton did not like being cast in such a radical light. At the end of September, Danton was shocked not to gain election. He consequently resolved to return to Arcis to rejoin his wife and son. Taking advantage of a windfall he received from the abolition of the King's Council, Danton paid off all his creditors and extended his family's estates in Arcis by buying cheap, confiscated church land. Nevertheless, politics and the capital soon beckoned again. Bailly was voted out as mayor of Paris on the 16th of November, and Lafayette was transferred to take command of the regular army on the eastern frontier. Danton returned to the capital and was elected deputy prosecutor. In his acceptance speech, he stated, "I have created what I am on my own and maintained my full native vigour without once ceasing, to show that I know how to marry cool reason with a burning soul and steadfast character." He swore to defend the new constitution that had been adopted in September and expressed the hope that the king, who still ruled, albeit as a virtual prisoner of the revolutionaries, would be a, quote, sincere friend of liberty. However, he also recognized that in the 2 years since the fall of the Bastille, the revolutionary government had done little to improve the people's economic well-being, and prices were still spiraling out of control. If the revolution was to survive and succeed, real-world problems needed to be dealt with effectively. Danton spent the winter taking care of his wife, who returned to Paris and gave birth to another son, François-Georges, in February 1792. He toned down his rhetoric and concerned himself with practical matters. Following the flight to Varennes several months earlier, the sovereigns of Austria and Prussia threatened war if the French king or queen were to come to any harm. While Danton saw war as inevitable, he also believed that every effort should be made to avoid it. Many revolutionaries were enthusiastic about the prospect of war, even the king. If France was invaded and Paris taken, Marie Antoinette's Austrian family could restore Louis XVI to absolute power. In the unlikely event of a French victory, the king might win popular support to improve his conditions. On the other side of the coin, Robespierre led an anti-war party which argued that defeat would crush the revolution, while victory might lead to a military dictatorship under an ambitious general such as Lafayette. Despite his own disagreements with Robespierre, Danton supported him on the war issue and strengthened his position among the Jacobins, who now formed a network of very powerful political clubs around the country. The reservations of Danton and others aside, the Legislative Assembly declared war on Austria and Prussia in late April 1792. The early movements were bleak for the French. Austrian and Prussian armies invaded the northeast and marched towards Paris. Most of the French army that opposed them was made up of untrained recruits, and they were led by Lafayette, a man who sympathized with the monarchy. Danton's antagonism towards Lafayette strengthened when the latter sent a message to the capital demanding more supplies and urging the Legislative Assembly to eliminate the Jacobins and Cordeliers. On the 20th of June 1792, the third anniversary of the taking of the famous tennis court oath at Versailles back in 1789, a Parisian mob stormed the Tuileries, calling for the king's head. Among them was Louis Legendre, a butcher from the Cordelier district, who broke into the king's quarters and read out a petition from Danton ordering Louis to respect the Constitution. Louis responded by taking a red Phrygian cap of the revolutionaries and placing it on his head as a gesture of solidarity, which was welcomed by the crowd. When Legendre related the tale of his exploits to the Cordelier Club, Danton was not impressed and criticized him for humiliating the king, to which the butcher replied that Danton had no idea what he wanted. The incident encouraged Lafayette to return to Paris to demand the arrest of the Jacobins and the Cordeliers. Ultimately, the divided Legislative Assembly decided to do nothing. In the meantime, the Austrians and Prussians closed on Paris, pledging via proclamation to restore the old monarchical order and put to death anyone who harmed the king and queen. In such an environment, Danton's views hardened, and he now moved to force the Assembly into creating a republic. With the support of hundreds of armed troops, he put his plan into action on the morning of the 10th of August by leading his insurrectionists to take over the city government. He was soon confronted by Jean-Antoine de Monda, the commander of the National Guard, who refused to obey his authority. Danton arrested Monda, but was furious when the latter was shot dead. While Danton stayed at City Hall, the revolutionaries marched on the Tuileries, where they did battle with the king's Swiss guards. A bloodbath ensued, and hundreds of Swiss guardsmen were killed. In the early hours of the 11th of August, Danton was informed that the Legislative Assembly appointed him as the Minister of Justice. There was no official head of government at this time, like a president or prime minister. Thus, with the extent of his support and his force of personality, Danton was now effectively in charge of the country at the age of 32. His authority was all the greater since the king had been stripped of his remaining powers, while the Legislative Assembly chose to reconstitute itself as the National Convention. News soon reached Paris that Lafayette had given up his command and defected to the Austrians. With the Austrians and Prussians closing on Paris, many members of the new National Convention proposed evacuating the government from Paris. Danton, though, vowed to stay, recognizing that Paris was the center of the revolution and had to be defended at all costs. In late August, he announced measures to intensify recruitment efforts throughout the country. He ramped up his rhetoric by declaring, quote, "We demand that whoever refuses to serve or to give the country his arms be punished by death." Marat, who was largely in control of the Paris mob through his newspaper articles by then, needed no second invitation, and on the same day, the sans-culottes stormed the prisons and massacred 1,600 prisoners, including Marie Antoinette's closest friend, the Princess de Lamballe. Danton, who believed in the rule of law even in a time of revolution, was appalled by this, but he refused to issue a call for the people to stand down, recognizing that it would undermine his efforts to rally the nation in the midst of the military emergency. On the 20th of September 1792, the French defeated the Austrians and Prussians at the Battle of Valmy, just around 120 miles to the east of Paris. As the news reached Paris, jubilant celebrations ensued. The revolution had been saved, at least for the time being. Upon sober reflection, Danton recognized that the revolution was not yet safe, and a more drastic political settlement was now needed in Paris. The same day as the Battle of Valmy, the National Convention met for the first time and abolished the monarchy. Danton retained his authority and popularity and took a seat in the national legislature for the first time, alongside such disparate figures as Robespierre, Marat, the Duke of Orléans, who called himself Philippe Égalité, and Thomas Paine, the English writer whose journalism had inspired the cause of American liberty and was now seeking to influence the revolution in France. The Girondins, a more moderate political grouping, won a large number of seats and took up their positions to the right of the Speaker, while a smaller group of radicals, including the Jacobins and Cordeliers, took up the benches opposite on the left. They were nicknamed the Mountain or Montagnards, as the seats on their side of the chamber rose steeply. As a convention deputy, Danton no longer had the right to be a government minister, and he announced his resignation from the government, but chose to stay on until a successor could be found. This enabled him to lead the negotiations with the Prussians to secure the withdrawal of their forces from France. Thanks to Marat's newspaper articles, theories had swirled that Danton intended to become a dictator. Hence, in a speech to the convention, just days after it assembled, he distanced himself from Marat. Meanwhile, on the 21st of September, a day into its proceedings, the convention declared the monarchy to be at an end and proclaimed the establishment of the First French Republic. Following the Prussian withdrawal across the Rhine, the most important issue facing the deputies of the convention in late 1792 involved the fate of the deposed Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette. In early November, Danton received a surprise visit from Alexandre de Lameth, a constitutional monarchist whom he had earlier helped to escape to England. In response to the visitor's pleas to save the king's life, Danton agreed that he would do what he could, but would not risk his own head if the majority was already against him. On the 13th of November 1792, the convention decided to put Louis on trial. Danton was convinced that Louis was guilty of treason for having conspired with his wife's Austrian brethren to invade France, but he probably shared Paine's view that his life should be spared, since to do otherwise would also be an act of tyranny. On the 20th of November, the Girondin Interior Minister, Jean-Marie Roland, produced a cache of secret documents from a safe in the Tuileries, which gave proof to Louis offering large sums of money to Mirabeau and Lafayette to defend his reputation. The minister's wife, the influential Madame Roland, was one of Danton's most prominent critics, but Danton's name was not mentioned. The documents further reduced Louis's slim chances of being acquitted, and Danton was not enthusiastic about participating in the trial, set to open on the 11th of December. He left Paris and went to the front lines of the war in the Low Countries, where the general was accused of wanting to make himself a dictator. The convention voted to annex the Austrian Netherlands to France in November, and Danton went to remind the commanding general there, Dumouriez, of the legislature's authority. After Dumouriez returned to Paris on leave on New Year's Day 1793, Danton remained to arrange the annexation of the Austrian Netherlands. Danton returned to Paris in time for the convention to pass judgment on Louis XVI. He was absent for the near-unanimous guilty verdict passed on the 15th of January, but on the 16th he spoke and voted in favour of the king's execution. The following day he spoke in opposition to a proposal to suspend the death sentence, which was rejected 380 to 310. On the 21st of January 1793, King Louis XVI was executed at the guillotine at the Place de la Révolution, now the Place de la Concorde. Danton returned to the Austrian Netherlands in early February, though he did so reluctantly, as Gabrielle was due to give birth in 3 weeks. Although Danton and others had tried to keep Britain out of the war, William Pitt's government was on the brink of entering it against France after King Louis's execution. In a speech to the convention shortly before his departure, Danton had delineated France's natural borders as being the ocean, the Rhine, the Alps and the Pyrenees, clearly laying out his belief that France should expand to the River Rhine by conquering everything to the west of it. The prospect of France controlling the Low Countries was unacceptable for Pitt. France declared war on Britain and the Netherlands preemptively on the 1st of February 1793, and Dumouriez marched north into Dutch territory. Then personal tragedy struck. On the 15th of February, Danton received word that his wife, Gabrielle, had died in childbirth 4 days earlier. He immediately set out for Paris and returned there the following day, where he was told that Gabrielle had been buried in a public cemetery 2 days earlier. Desperate to see her again, he paid a sculptor to join him in going to the cemetery in the middle of the night to exhume her body and make a bust of her image. The coffin was dug up and taken to the cemetery's tool shed, where Danton dived in to embrace the cold body of his wife. He then placed her onto the lid and gestured to the sculptor to get to work. Among the numerous messages of condolence he received, Danton was surprised to see Robespierre's was amongst the most empathetic, perhaps because the Montagnards wanted him as an ally against the Girondins. Danton grieved for several weeks, but by March he was back at the front in the Low Countries, where Dumouriez and his 20,000 men were in headlong retreat. In the face of the Dutch attack, Danton quickly returned to Paris, where he urged the convention to keep faith in the commander. Within less than 2 weeks, he was back in Brussels after Dumouriez had sent a letter to the convention accusing the government of incompetence. After securing an agreement with the general that he would return to Paris to present his grievances to the convention in person, Danton returned to the capital. On the 18th of March 1793, Dumouriez was defeated at the Battle of Neerwinden. Then, to Danton's horror, in early April he defected to the Austrians. The French reverses in the Low Countries were accompanied by outbreaks of peasant uprisings throughout the country. During a long parliamentary session, Danton urged unity before a hopelessly divided convention and proposed a special revolutionary tribunal to send counter-revolutionaries to the guillotine, arguing that it was better for the government to be in control of the process than for the sans-culottes to take matters into their own hands. Danton and the Montagnards pushed for the convention to establish a body to strengthen executive government, and on the 6th of April, the Committee of Public Safety was created. Of the 9 people elected to the body, none were Girondins. Danton was by far the most prominent, and this meant that he was now, at 33 years of age, yet again the de facto head of government. However, on this occasion, the institution that he had created would unleash the worst bloodshed of the revolution and cost him his own head. Danton was once again faced with having to save the revolution from enemies within and without. In Paris, the sans-culottes were baying for blood, fueled by Marat and Jacques-René Hébert, a radical journalist who had taken over the Cordeliers Club, while Desmoulins was calling for all the moderate Girondins to be guillotined, as war and counter-revolution bred paranoia and extremism. Terror became a way of life in Paris as personal and political feuds found their way onto the desk of Antoine Quentin Fouquier-Tinville, the radical head of the Revolutionary Tribunal, who did not hesitate to send the accused to the guillotine. As early as April, the Girondins were demanding that Danton himself appear before the Revolutionary Tribunal for his dealings with Dumouriez. Danton countered that Dumouriez shared the Girondins' support for a constitutional monarchy. This drew Danton closer to the radicals, and he stepped in to save Marat from a guilty verdict before the tribunal on the 24th of April. This, in turn, encouraged the sans-culottes to take the offensive, and Madame Roland was arrested on the 31st of May, though her husband escaped earlier that day. On the 2nd of June, a group of sans-culottes appeared at the convention to arrest 29 Girondin deputies, several of whom would soon escape captivity and flee to Normandy. While Madame Roland was convinced that Danton was behind all of these actions, in reality he was not the instigator and was content to send them to exile. At the same time, Danton decided to move on from the loss of his wife. On the 12th of June 1793, 4 months after Gabrielle's death, Danton married the 16-year-old Louise XVI, a close friend of Gabrielle's who had helped her bring up the Danton children. Although Danton wanted time to settle down with his young wife, the Montagnards were keeping up the pressure on him to take action against counter-revolutionaries. The military situation was getting worse. The political climate prevented Danton from carrying out his plans to exchange Marie Antoinette for peace with Austria. In July, Danton was unexpectedly voted off the Committee of Public Safety, which was taken over by Robespierre and his young protégé, Louis-Antoine de Saint-Just. A few days later, on the 13th of July, 1793, Marat was assassinated in his bathtub by Charlotte Corday, a Girondin sympathizer. Although the fire-breathing journalist had lately been one of Danton's fiercest critics, his removal left Danton and Robespierre locked in a power struggle over the trajectory of the revolution. Despite his fiery rhetoric, Danton had made efforts to reach out to his political opponents in France and to make peace with France's enemies abroad, while Robespierre could not conceive of taking a step backwards. Danton's fortunes improved when he was elected president of the National Convention for the month of August, and he used the opportunity to present a proposal for free universal education. The same month, in response to Danton's calls for mobilization, the convention decreed the first levée en masse, conscripting 400,000 men into the ranks of the Republican armies. Danton's popularity enjoyed a revival, but despite being elected to rejoin the Committee of Public Safety in early September, he refused to do so out of an ill-conceived desire to demonstrate to the Montagnards that he was not power-hungry. His decision was criticized by his friends and allies, who could see that he was handing the initiative to Robespierre. Having taken control of the Committee of Public Safety, Robespierre was arresting defeated generals and sending them to the Revolutionary Tribunal. Marie Antoinette was due for execution before the end of the year, and time was also running out for the Girondins. Danton did not want any of them to die, but nothing that he could say in their defense would change the outcome and would only place a target on his back. In mid-October, Danton left Paris for Arcis, where he avoided the newspapers and aimed to enjoy life with his teenage wife. He could not avoid hearing of the execution of Marie Antoinette on the 16th of October 1793, an action which ensured that the wars would now continue indefinitely, particularly with Austria. 2 weeks later, 22 Girondin deputies were executed, and then the former Duke of Orléans went to the guillotine on the 6th of November as Robespierre's bloody reign of terror got worse and worse. Eventually, tens of thousands would die in 1793 and 1794, either in prison or via the guillotine. Days later, one of Danton's nephews urged him to return to Paris, as Robespierre was now targeting the Cordeliers. Fabre and Desmoulins desperately required Danton's thundering presence in the convention hall to defend their cause. After Danton returned to Paris on the 20th of November, he and Desmoulins set up the newspaper Vieux Cordelier to call for an end to the terror. They initially avoided attacking Robespierre directly and instead targeted Hébert, who complained that Robespierre was not eliminating enemies of the revolution quickly enough. Robespierre was keen to be rid of Hébert, who was eventually arrested and executed in March of 1794. Before then, Robespierre and Saint-Just had moved against Danton's associates. For instance, on the 13th of January 1794, a few months after helping Robespierre create a new republican calendar, Fabre was arrested for his part in a corruption scandal involving the French East India Company, and a couple of weeks later, Robespierre had the Vieux Cordeliers silenced. Danton continued to hold his own at the convention and successfully proposed the abolition of slavery in the colonies, but he made no more speeches after the end of March 1794. When his friends urged him to launch a preemptive strike on Robespierre to save himself, Danton refused to spill more blood. On the 22nd of March, Danton met Robespierre in an attempt to resolve their differences. While Danton agreed that it was necessary to punish those who were in any way guilty of counter-revolutionary actions or plotting against the state, he urged his adversary to moderate the use of the guillotine and not to mete out severe punishments to those who had committed minor crimes. Although the two men embraced each other at the end of their meeting, just over a week later, on the 30th of March, Danton received word that the Committee of Public Safety had issued a warrant for his arrest. Despite desperate calls by his supporters for him to escape, he vowed to stay put and stand his ground against any accusers. Together with Desmoulins and fellow Cordelier Jean-François de Lacroix, Danton was arrested that evening. When news reached the convention the following morning, the butcher Legendre stood up to defend his friend, reminding the deputies of Danton's role in bringing down the monarchy in 1792 and his success in mobilizing the people to save France from the enemies at the gates when the Austrians and Prussians had threatened Paris early on in the wars. The convention was poised to vote to release Danton when Robespierre arrived and cowered the deputies into submission. Saint-Just then stepped up to reel off a long list of charges against Danton. There were several counts of treason, conspiracy, corruption and dereliction of duty. Without presenting a shred of evidence to accompany his insinuations and allegations, Saint-Just had the convention endorse the decree to arrest Danton and his fellow Cordeliers. In the early hours of the 31st of March 1794, Georges Danton and his comrades were taken to the prison at the Luxembourg Palace. Any hopes that the sans-culottes might come to their rescue rapidly faded away. 2 days later, the sham trial opened at the Palais de Justice, with President of the Court, Marshal Herman, chairing proceedings. Fouquier and Herman had taken particular care to ensure that the verdict went their way, limiting themselves to 7 jurors whom they could trust. Danton was determined for his voice to be heard and resisted Herman's attempts to bring him to order. It was only on the 3rd day that he was made to answer charges for supporting Dumouriez's plans to overthrow the government. Danton stated his innocence and demanded that the government present proof of their claim, reminding the courtroom that hearsay was not evidence and that he had been a loyal advocate of the revolution. When Herman refused the defendant's permission to call witnesses, it became even clearer that the scales of justice were unbalanced. Fouquier desperately wrote to the Committee of Public Safety to request instructions on the evening of the 4th of April. Danton, after all, was a lawyer and a gifted orator, and well able to try and defend himself, even with the cards stacked so firmly against him. In response, Saint-Just fabricated rumours of an uprising at the Luxembourg prison designed to free Danton and crush the tribunal. Proceedings drew to a close on the 5th of April. Even then, the jurors were hesitant to condemn Danton, and did so only when threatened. Robespierre did not wait around after that. At 4 in the afternoon, Danton and his fellow defendants made their journey to the Place de la Révolution, passing Robespierre's house along the way, at which Danton shouted, "You're next!" He was not wrong. Danton was executed shortly afterwards on the 5th of April. Just 16 weeks later, Robespierre's reign of terror was brought to an end in an uprising known as the Thermidorian Reaction on the 27th of July, 1794. He was executed the following day, and the French Revolution moved to a more moderate phase. Had he survived for another 4 months, Danton might well have become the key figure in the French government after the Thermidorian Reaction. While he might have only lived to his 35th year, Georges Danton left his mark on history as one of the most influential leaders of the French Revolution. He first arrived at Paris as a 20-year-old legal apprentice. Although he served on the King's Council, he had no particular affection for the monarchy, and he was in favour of extensive political reform being implemented when the French Revolution began in 1789. In the early years of the Revolution, he was popular in the political clubs of Paris, but often struggled to acquire official recognition in the various revolutionary assemblies. It was during the emergency of 1792, as the French Revolutionary Wars commenced, that he came to the fore in French politics, playing a key role in the abolition of the monarchy. Danton led France through several crises during 2 brief stints as head of government, but struggled to restrain the bloody and radical forces that he himself had unleashed in so many ways. As the streets of Paris ran red with blood, he and Robespierre were locked in a struggle for power. Although Danton was first to the guillotine, Robespierre would follow him a mere 4 months later. In his belated appeals for moderation and unity, Danton recognized that the cycle of revolutionary violence that they unleashed would make both of them victims. Eventually, after Danton's own passing, the revolution devoured itself and evolved into military dictatorship and empire. What do you think of Georges Danton? Was he an effective political leader who did all he could to improve the lives of ordinary French people? Or was he a populist rabble-rouser who sent many innocent men and women to the guillotine in an effort to claim as much power as he could amass for himself? Please let us know in the comment section. And in the meantime, thank you very much for watching.